The sun beat down on Willow Creek Station, a merciless white-hot glare that made the tracks shimmer like a mirage. Heath Norton stood on that platform, just like he had every day for 3 months, waiting. The town thought he was a fool. Benjamin, the station master, told him so every afternoon. "That Eastern woman ain't comin', Heath. Go home." But Heath just leaned against the post, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He'd made a promise. In a letter, he'd told her he would be there. And Heath Norton didn't break his promises. Not ever. The 3 train from St. Louis was always late, but its whistle was the most reliable thing in his life. He heard it then, a lonely cry across the plains. His heart did the same stupid thing it did every day. It hammered against his ribs. A fool's hope. The iron beast rounded the bend, spitting black smoke, and screeched to a halt. Steam hissed and billowed, smelling of hot metal and coal. Passengers got off. A salesman, a family with tired children, the usual faces heading west to chase a dream or run from a nightmare. Heath scanned them all, his hope already turning to ash. Another day wasted. Another ride home to an empty house. And then he saw her. She stood on the platform, blinking in the harsh sun, a green traveling dress looking like a blade of new grass in a desert. Priscilla Anderson. Chestnut hair, fair skin, and eyes the color of sage. Exactly like she'd written. Exactly like he'd pictured. But something was wrong. As he stepped forward, hat in hand, her eyes found his. And in them, he didn't see the weary traveler or the hopeful bride-to-be. He saw a flicker of pure animal terror. It was gone in a second, replaced by a practiced smile. "Mr. Norton," she said, her voice a little too high, a little too tight. She extended a gloved hand. He took it, felt the tremble she couldn't hide. "I apologize for my tardiness," she said. "There were complications." 3 months is more than tardiness, Miss Anderson. His own voice sounded rough, raw from disuse. Her perfect smile faltered. For just a moment, the mask slipped. "I can explain everything," she said, glancing around the platform, at the curious eyes of the townspeople who had watched his long vigil. "But perhaps not here." He nodded, grabbing her small valise. It was heavier than it looked. Deceptively so. "Is this all?" he asked. "The rest will arrive next week. I couldn't wait any longer." Those words should have warmed him. They didn't. They sounded rehearsed. He helped her onto the wagon, the wood groaning under their combined weight. As he flicked the reins, he felt her tense beside him. She was wound as tight as a watch spring, her back ramrod straight. She wasn't just tired from a long journey. She was running from something, and he had the sinking feeling it had followed her all the way to Wyoming. The silence stretched as the wagon rumbled out of town. "You were 3 months late," Heath said, breaking it. "I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind." A faint blush touched her cheeks. "Not a stranger," she corrected him. "We've exchanged 30 letters. I feel I know you." "Letters can lie," Heath said, the words sharper than he intended. Her head snapped toward him, and for the first time he saw a flash of fire in those sage-green eyes. "So can people," she countered. The fire was real. The fear had been real. The polite smile was the lie. He showed her the ranch, the sturdy 2-story house he'd built with his own hands, the corrals, the vast grasslands where his cattle grazed. He pointed out the guest cabin, a smaller, cozier version of the main house, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods. "I had Mrs. Winters prepare it for you," he explained. "It's yours for as long as you need it." Relief washed over her face, so potent it was like a physical blow. It wasn't the relief of a weary traveler finding a safe harbor. It was the relief of a fugitive who just found a new place to hide. Mrs. Winters, his housekeeper, met them with a warm embrace and a flood of cheerful chatter. Priscilla handled it with a grace that seemed both natural and practiced. He watched her as she followed the older woman to the cabin, her posture perfect, her steps measured. She was putting on a performance, and she was damn good at it. but he'd spent too many years reading the subtle signs of a nervous horse or a spooked steer. This woman was on the verge of bolting. That evening, she knocked on his door for dinner. She'd changed into a simple blue dress, her hair pinned loosely. She looked younger, softer, more like the woman from the letters. She admired his house, his bookshelves. "You have quite a collection," she said, her fingers tracing the leather spines. She was trying so hard to be normal. Over a meal of roast beef and potatoes, she told him her story. Her father, a stern Bostonian, had fallen ill with pneumonia just before she was set to leave. She couldn't abandon him. She'd written 3 letters to explain, but he'd never received them. The spring floods, he reasoned. Mail service was unreliable. It all made perfect sense, except it didn't. Her story was seamless, polished. She'd told it before. Maybe she'd even told it to herself, over and over again on the long train ride west. As she spoke, she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. And that's when he saw it. A thin white scar circling her left wrist, almost invisible against her pale skin. It looked like an old rope burn. She saw him notice. Her hand flew to her sleeve, pulling it down, her flow of words faltering for a beat before she recovered. But he had seen it, and he had seen the panic in her eyes. He walked her back to her cabin, under a sky littered with stars. The air was cool and smelled of sage. At her door, she turned. "Thank you for waiting for me, Heath," she said softly. The words were genuine, he thought. Maybe the only truly genuine words she'd spoken all day. He just nodded, his mind racing. She hesitated, then stood on her toes and pressed a quick, chaste kiss to his cheek before disappearing inside. He stood there for a long time, the spot on his cheek tingling. He wasn't a fool waiting for a mail-order bride anymore. He was a man who had just invited a storm into his home, and he had no idea how destructive it would be. He walked back to his porch and sat in the dark, watching her cabin. An hour passed. 2. The light in her window stayed on. He expected to see her shadow moving about, unpacking, settling in. Instead, her silhouette was perfectly still, framed in the window. She wasn't looking at the mountains or the stars. She was staring down the long, dark road that led back to town, back to the train tracks, back to whatever she had left behind. She wasn't unpacking. She was keeping watch. The next morning, he offered to show her the ranch. He needed to see her in the daylight, away from the soft lies of the lamplit dinner table. "I'm not much of a rider," she confessed. So they took the wagon. He pointed out the landmarks, the creek, the best grazing lands. She listened, asking intelligent questions, her interest seeming genuine. He introduced her to his foreman, Thomas, and the other hands. The men were polite, tipping their hats, their eyes full of curiosity. They'd all heard the story of the boss and his phantom bride. Now, here she was, in the flesh, a fragile-looking woman with haunted eyes. He took her to his favorite spot, a high bluff that overlooked the entire valley. "You can see everything from here," he said, helping her down from the wagon. They stood in silence, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "There's a freedom here." He watched her profile, the way her eyes scanned the vast, empty landscape. It wasn't the gaze of a woman admiring the view. It was the gaze of a prisoner tasting fresh air for the first time. "What made you answer my advertisement, Priscilla?" He asked it flat out. He needed to hear the story again, to see if it held up under the harsh Wyoming sun. She turned, her eyes meeting his. She gave him the same story she'd told over dinner. Her controlling father, the arranged marriage, her mother's withered life. "I didn't want that fate," she said, her voice filled with a convincing passion. "Your letters, they spoke of partnership. You mentioned books." It was a good answer. It was the answer that had made him wait for 3 months. But the scar on her wrist told a different story. The fear in her eyes told a different story. He let it go. For now. "There's a town social tonight," he said, changing the subject. "It'd be a good chance for you to meet folks." Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I'd like that. That evening, she emerged from her cabin wearing a deep burgundy dress. She looked stunning. As he helped her into the wagon, his hand brushed her arm, and he felt her flinch, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor. In town, the church hall was buzzing with music and conversation. Every eye turned to them as they entered. Heath felt a grim satisfaction. Let them stare. Let them whisper. He introduced her to everyone. Benjamin Lawson, the station master, the blacksmith, the doctor. She was charming, poised, and graceful. She remembered names, laughed at the right times, and deflected personal questions with a skill that was breathtaking to watch. She was a chameleon, perfectly adapting to her new surroundings. Too perfectly. Eliza Winters, the housekeeper's daughter, cornered him by the punch bowl. She's special, Heath, Eliza said, her eyes sharp. Education doesn't give you that kind of watchfulness. She's scanning the room like she's looking for an escape route. He knew. He'd been watching it too. Then the music started, a lively waltz. He asked her to dance. As he took her in his arms, he felt how tense she was. Her hand was cold in his. They moved together across the floor, a picture of burgeoning courtship for the whole town to see. Everyone's watching us, she whispered. Let them watch, he said, pulling her a little closer than was proper. And that's when he saw him. A man standing by the door, a stranger. He was dressed like a traveling salesman, but his eyes weren't on the festivities. They were locked on Priscilla. And the look on her face wasn't charm or poise. It was the same raw terror he'd seen at the train station, magnified 100 times. She stumbled, her hand clutching his arm. I feel faint, she stammered, her face pale as a sheet. I need some air. He guided her out the side door into the cool night, away from the prying eyes, away from the stranger who was still watching them from the doorway. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Who was that man? Heath asked, his voice low. She shook her head, not meeting his eyes. I don't know. I've never seen him before. The heat. It was just the heat in the room. Another lie. A clumsy one this time. She was a terrible liar when she was scared. He didn't press her. He took her home, the wagon ride shrouded in a tense, suffocating silence. He walked her to her cabin door. Priscilla, he began, but she cut him off. Please, Heath. I'm just tired. She slipped inside and bolted the door. He heard the heavy sound of the deadbolt sliding into place. The next morning, the stranger was gone. Benjamin Lawson told him the man had taken the first train east at dawn. He'd paid for his room at the hotel for a week, but left after one night. It didn't make sense, but Priscilla seemed to breathe easier. A fragile calm settled over the ranch. She helped Mrs. Winters, started a small garden, and even let him teach her to ride a horse. She was a fast learner, determined and surprisingly strong. She was trying so hard to fit in, to become the woman he thought he was getting. For a few days, he almost let himself believe it. He almost let himself believe the woman from the letters was real. Then, her trunks arrived from St. Louis. There were 3 of them. 2 were filled with books and clothes, just as she'd said. The third was different. It was smaller, bound in iron, and secured with a heavy, intricate lock. It was the reason her small valise had been so heavy. It had been filled with books to hide the weight of this chest. She saw him looking at it. Family heirlooms, she said quickly, her hand hovering protectively over the lock. They're very delicate. He watched as she and Mrs. Winters carried it into her cabin. She didn't unpack it. She slid it under her bed, a metal secret in her wooden sanctuary. That night he couldn't sleep. The questions hammered at him. The scar, the stranger, the locked chest. He walked out onto his porch, staring at her cabin. Her light was on. Driven by a need he couldn't explain, he moved silently through the darkness, stopping in the shadows of the cottonwood trees. Her curtains weren't fully drawn. He could see inside. She wasn't reading or sewing. She was on her knees, the iron-bound chest open before her. The contents were spilled out on the floor. It wasn't delicate heirlooms, it was bundles of cash. More money than he'd ever seen in one place, and a small, pearl-handled pistol. As he watched, she picked up the pistol, her movements sure and familiar. She checked the cylinder, then sighted down the barrel at an imaginary target in the corner of the room. This was no fainting flower from Boston. This was a woman who knew how to handle a gun. A woman with a fortune in cash and a past so dangerous she had to bolt her door at night. His mail-order bride was a lie, and he was standing in the middle of it. He backed away, his mind reeling. He didn't confront her. What could he say? I saw the gun you keep next to a pile of money in your secret chest? The next week was a strange dance. They were polite, friendly even. They ate meals together, rode out to check the herds, and talked about books and ranching. But underneath it all, the truth simmered. He knew she was lying, and she knew he was watching her. The tension was a living thing between them, a coiled snake ready to strike. Then, a month after her arrival, a letter came. It bore a Boston postmark. He watched her face as she took it from Benjamin at the post office. All the color drained from her cheeks. Her hand trembled as she broke the seal. He didn't have to ask what was in it. He could see it in the way her shoulders slumped, the way the terror flooded back into her eyes. My father, she whispered, her voice cracking. He's had a heart attack. He's asking for me. It was the perfect excuse. A reason to run that he couldn't argue with. When's the next train? He asked, his voice flat. Tomorrow at noon. Her eyes were filled with a desperate plea. Heath, I have to go. Of course you do, he said. Family is family. She looked surprised by his easy acceptance. I'll be back, she promised, her voice earnest. 2 weeks. 3 at the most. It was just another line in her well-rehearsed play. That evening, he helped her pack. She moved with a frantic energy, throwing things into her bags. She avoided his eyes. She was ready to bolt. As darkness fell, they stood outside her cabin. The air was thick with unspoken words. This isn't goodbye, she said, trying to smile. It's just until we meet again. He looked down at her, at this beautiful, complicated, dangerous woman. And he did something he hadn't planned on. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, chaste kiss like the one she'd given him. It was hard and demanding, a kiss that tasted of frustration and a strange, unwelcome desire. She stiffened in surprise, then melted against him, her response desperate and hungry. When he pulled away, they were both breathless. I should have done that weeks ago, he murmured. Yes, she whispered, a real smile finally touching her lips. You should have. The next morning, he drove her to the station. He watched her climb aboard the train. Her green traveling dress, a vivid splash of color against the dusty platform. I will come back, she called from the window. He didn't answer. He just watched until the train was a black speck on the horizon. He knew she wasn't coming back. Priscilla Anderson had vanished as quickly as she had appeared. He drove back to the ranch, the silence in the wagon screaming at him. He felt hollowed out, a fool twice over, once for waiting and once for letting her go. He walked into her empty cabin. It smelled faintly of her, of lavender and soap. He knelt and reached under the bed. The iron-bound chest was gone. Of course it was, but as his hand swept across the dusty floorboards, his fingers brushed against something small and metallic. A key. A small, ornate brass key. She must have dropped it in her haste. He stared at it. Then his eyes went to the largest of the trunks she had left behind, the one filled with books and clothes. He walked over to it, his heart pounding. There was a small, almost invisible lock set into its side, a lock he hadn't noticed before. With a trembling hand, he inserted the key. It turned. He lifted the lid. Inside, beneath a layer of woolen dresses, was a false bottom. He pried it open. There were no bundles of cash, no gun. There was only a stack of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon, and a leather-bound journal. He opened the journal. The first page read, My name is Lena, and Priscilla Anderson is dead. He sank to the floor, the journal in his hands. He read for hours as the sun set and the cabin filled with shadows. The story that unfolded was uglier than anything he could have imagined. Lena was not from a wealthy Boston family. She was an orphan, taken in as a companion to the real Priscilla Anderson, a frail, sickly girl. They had grown up like sisters. Priscilla's father was not a stern patriarch. He was a kind, gentle man who treated Lena as his own. The monster in the story was a man named Alistair Finch. Finch was Priscilla's fiancé, a man of immense wealth and influence, with a cruelty that he hid behind a charming facade. He didn't love Priscilla. He desired her family's name and fortune. And he desired Lena. The journal detailed Finch's advances, his threats, his possessive rage. Priscilla, weak and terrified of the man she was supposed to marry, couldn't protect her friend. So they had made a plan. Priscilla had answered Heath's mail-order bride advertisement, not for herself, but for Lena. It was to be Lena's escape. They scraped together every dollar they could, selling small pieces of jewelry, saving from their allowances. That was the money in the chest. But Finch had found out. The night before Lena was supposed to leave, he had confronted them. There was a struggle. Finch, in a blind rage, had pushed Priscilla. Her weak heart had given out. She died on the floor of her bedroom. Finch, realizing he had killed his fiancée, panicked. He created a story, a sudden illness, a tragic decline, and he gave Lena an ultimatum. She would stay, become his creature, his possession, and he would protect her. Or he would frame her for Priscilla's murder. No one would believe an orphan over a man of his standing. So Lena ran. She took Priscilla's ticket, her name, her story. The 3-month delay wasn't because of a sick father. It was because she was in hiding, moving from one boarding house to another, terrified that Finch's men would find her. The stranger at the dance must have been one of them. The letter wasn't from her father. It was from Finch. A summons. A threat. She hadn't gone back to Boston for a funeral. She had gone back to be caged. Heath closed the journal, his knuckles white. The woman he knew as Priscilla wasn't a liar. She was a survivor. She hadn't abandoned him. She had run to protect him. He thought of her on that train, heading back into the lion's den, alone. Rage, cold and pure, surged through him. He stood up. He walked to the main house, to the locked gun case in his study. Alistair Finch wanted to play games. Fine. But he was about to find out that Wyoming wasn't Boston. And Heath Norton wasn't a man who let monsters win. He didn't know what to do. Ride to Boston? He'd be a stranger in a strange city, a rancher blundering into a world of power and influence he didn't understand. Send a telegram? To whom? He felt helpless, caught in a story that was not his own, but was now wrapped around his soul. He spent the night pacing, the journal a lead weight in his hand. He had misjudged her at every turn. Her fear wasn't a weakness. It was a weapon that had kept her alive. Her lies weren't deceptions. They were shields. A week passed. Then 2. The silence from the east was deafening. Every day at 3 he found himself looking toward the horizon, listening for the train whistle. Not with hope, but with a grim, aching dread. What was happening to her? Had Finch broken her? Had he locked her away? The thought was a physical pain. He was cleaning out the guest cabin, boxing up the few things she had left behind when he found it. Tucked inside a copy of Jane Eyre was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a letter, it was a newspaper clipping, months old, from a Boston paper. A small article detailing the sudden, tragic death of socialite Priscilla Anderson from a long-standing heart condition, and beside it, a wedding announcement. The grieving fiancé, Mr. Alistair Finch, had postponed his upcoming nuptials indefinitely. But that wasn't what made Heath's blood run cold. It was the photograph accompanying the article. A picture of Alistair Finch. It was the man from the church social. The traveling salesman. He hadn't just recognized her. He had been confirming his target. And the telegram he sent that night? It wasn't a sales report. It was a message to his master. "I've found her." The letter that had called her back wasn't a summons. It was the closing of a trap. Finch hadn't waited for her to come to him. He was coming to her. Heath ran from the cabin, his mind racing. He saddled his fastest horse and rode for town like a man possessed. He had to get to the telegraph office. He had to warn someone. But who? As he galloped down the main street, he saw Benjamin Lawson step out of the station house, a yellow envelope in his hand. A telegram. "Heath!" Benjamin called out. "This just came for you." Heath slid from his horse, his heart hammering. He ripped the envelope open. The message was short, cryptic. "Arriving Thursday noon. Train. Expecting to collect my property. All will be in order. A. Finch. Thursday." That was today. Noon. He looked at the station clock. It was 11:45. The train whistle screamed in the distance. Panic flared in his chest, hot and sharp. He had 15 minutes. 15 minutes before hell arrived on the 3-hour train. He looked around the dusty main street. The blacksmith hammering at his anvil. The shopkeeper sweeping his stoop. These were good people, but they weren't fighters. Not against a man like Finch, who would surely not be coming alone. He was a rancher. He knew how to handle rustlers and predators. And Alistair Finch was the worst kind of predator. He ran into the station house. "Benjamin," he said, his voice tight. "I need you to do something for me. No questions." The old station master looked at the telegram in Heath's hand, then at the look in his eyes, and nodded. "Anything. When that train pulls in, I want you to create a diversion. Something big. Something that will draw every eye." "What kind of diversion?" "I don't care. Fake a heart attack. Announce the president is on board. Set a fire in a trash can. Just give me 2 minutes." Benjamin's eyes widened, but he just nodded again. 2 minutes. You got it. Heath ran back outside. His foreman, Thomas, was in town picking up supplies. Heath saw him tying his horse to the rail outside the general store. "Thomas!" he yelled. Thomas turned, surprised. Heath grabbed him by the arm. "I need you, and I need every man from the ranch you can find in town. Get them! Get them now! Tell them to bring their rifles and meet me at the livery stable, and tell them to stay out of sight." Thomas didn't hesitate. He saw the grim set of his boss's jaw and knew this was life or death. He untied his horse and galloped down the street, shouting for the other ranch hands. Heath took a deep breath. It wasn't much of a plan. It wasn't much of an army, but it was all he had. He sprinted to the livery stable at the far end of the platform, his boots kicking up dust. He slipped inside, the air thick with the smell of hay and horses. He pulled his own rifle from its scabbard on his saddle. He checked the action. It was ready. Through the dusty window, he watched the train pull into the station, its iron wheels screeching. The engine hissed, steam enveloping the platform. He saw Alistair Finch step off the train. He was exactly as Heath remembered, impeccably dressed, an arrogant sneer on his face. And he was not alone. 2 large, thuggish-looking men in city suits flanked him. Hired muscle. Finch scanned the platform, his eyes searching for Lena. He expected her to be there, waiting, defeated. And that's when Benjamin Lawson, clutching his chest, let out a theatrical groan and collapsed onto a baggage cart. It was a magnificent performance. People shouted. The conductor ran over. Every passenger, every person on the platform, turned to look at the commotion. All except Finch and his men. Their eyes stayed fixed on the passenger cars. They were waiting for someone else. Heath's blood froze. He had assumed Finch was coming for Lena, but she wasn't here. She was in Boston. Then who? The last passenger stepped off the train. It was a woman, dressed in black, a heavy veil covering her face. She stood for a moment, then slowly, deliberately, she lifted the veil. It was Lena. She hadn't gone to Boston. She had gotten off the train at the last stop, sold a piece of jewelry for cash, and bought a ticket back. She hadn't run back to her cage. She had run back to the only place she'd ever felt a flicker of freedom. Back to him. Finch saw her. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a collector who had just found his most prized possession. "Lena, my dear," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet platform. "Did you really think you could run from me?" Lena's face was pale, but her eyes burned with defiance. She didn't answer. His smile widened. "It's time to go home. We have a wedding to plan." He took a step toward her, and that's when Heath stepped out of the livery stable, his rifle held loosely at his side. "She's not going anywhere," Heath said, his voice calm and steady. Finch turned, his eyes narrowing as he took in the dusty rancher. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "And who are you? The stable boy?" "I'm the man whose fiancée you're bothering," Heath said. He saw a flash of surprise, then something else, gratitude, in Lena's eyes. Finch's amusement vanished, replaced by a cold fury. "She is my property. Promised to me. You have no claim here, farmer." "This is Wyoming, Mr. Finch," Heath said, taking a slow step forward. "We don't hold much with men who talk about women like they're cattle. And out here, a man's word, a promise. That's the only claim that matters. And Miss Anderson," he put a heavy emphasis on her chosen name, "has promised herself to me." Finch's face contorted with rage. "You think you can stop me?" He gestured to his two thugs, who both reached inside their coats. "She belongs to me." From the rooftops across the street, from the alleyways, from the doorways of the shops, Heath's men appeared. Thomas, the other ranch hands, the blacksmith, holding his hammer like a weapon. They weren't an army. They were just men who had seen something wrong and were willing to stand against it. Finch's men froze, their hands still inside their coats. They were outnumbered 10-1. Finch looked around, his face a mask of disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. The world was supposed to bend to his will. "This isn't over," he snarled at Heath. "I will ruin you. I will ruin this entire pathetic town." "Maybe," Heath said, "but not today." He walked over to Lena, never taking his eyes off Finch. He gently took her arm. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go home." He led her toward his wagon. The townsfolk parted for them, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. As he helped her onto the seat, he heard Finch shout his name. "Norton!" Heath turned. Finch's face was twisted with a desperate final rage. He had pulled a small derringer from his pocket and was leveling it at Heath. Everything slowed down. He heard Lena scream his name. He saw the flash from the barrel. He felt a searing pain rip through his shoulder. He staggered back, his own rifle clattering to the ground. But before Finch could fire again, a second shot rang out. Not from the rooftops, not from the street. It came from the wagon. Lena stood on the seat, the pearl-handled pistol from her secret chest held steady in both hands, a thin wisp of smoke curling from its barrel. Alistair Finch stared at her, a look of profound surprise on his face. A small, dark hole had appeared in the center of his pristine white shirt. He crumpled to the platform without a sound. There was a moment of stunned silence, then chaos. Finch's two men, seeing their employer dead, made a run for the train. They didn't get far. The blacksmith and two of Heath's hands cut them off, and the fight was over before it began. Lena dropped the pistol and jumped down from the wagon, rushing to Heath's side. "You're hurt!" she cried, her hands fluttering over his bleeding shoulder. "It's nothing," he grunted, the pain sharp but distant. Adrenaline was a powerful anesthetic. He looked at her, at the fierce, protective light in her eyes. "You saved my life." "You saved mine first," she whispered. The town sheriff, a man more accustomed to dealing with drunks than gunfights, finally arrived. He looked at the body on the platform, at the two thugs being held by ranch hands, at Heath leaning against the wagon, and at the beautiful woman with the smoking pistol lying at her feet. "Heath," the sheriff said, rubbing his jaw, "what in tarnation happened here?" "Just a disagreement over property," Heath said, looking at Lena. "Turns out it was never his to claim." The story became a legend in Willow Creek. The day the quiet rancher and his mail-order bride faced down the devil from Boston. No one asked too many questions about who Lena really was. They just knew she was Heath Norton's woman, and that was enough. The law called it self-defense. Finch had fired first. The whole town had seen it. His men were sent back east on the next train with a clear message: don't come back. Heath's wound was painful but clean. The doctor dug the bullet out, and Lena nursed him with a tenderness that spoke more than words ever could. In the quiet days of his recovery, she told him everything. Not just the facts from her journal, but the feelings, the terror, the hopelessness, the flicker of hope his letters had ignited. "I was so afraid," she confessed one evening as they sat on the porch. "Afraid you'd turn me away when you found out I wasn't who I said I was." "Lena," he said, taking her hand, "I don't care what your name is. I care who you are. And who you are is the bravest woman I've ever met." He pulled a small, simple gold band from his pocket. He'd bought it the day after the shootout. "I know this isn't how it was supposed to happen, but I meant what I said at the station. I want you to be my wife. Lena, not Priscilla. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Heath. With all my heart." They were married a month later in the small church. The whole town came. She didn't wear a fancy dress from Boston. She wore a simple cream-colored dress sewn by the women of the town. She wasn't Priscilla Anderson, the runaway bride. She was Lena Norton, the woman who had found her home. As they stood on the church steps, surrounded by their new friends and family, Heath looked down at his wife. He thought of the long months he had waited on the train platform, waiting for a ghost, a woman made of paper and ink. He hadn't found that woman. He had found someone better, someone real, someone who had fought her own dragons and won. "Mrs. Norton," he said, trying out the name. "It suits you." She laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "It does, doesn't it?" she said. "I think I've finally found a name that fits." They walked back to the ranch, hand in hand. The cowboy had waited at the depot. But the woman who stepped off the train wasn't the one he was expecting. She was a storm. She was a survivor. She was his future. And their story was just beginning. 5 years later, Heath stood on that same platform, but he wasn't alone. A small boy with dark hair and sage-green eyes held his hand. "Is Mama on the train, Pa?" 4-year-old Thomas asked, bouncing on his heels. "She is," Heath said, smiling. The train pulled in, and Lena stepped off. She was returning from Cheyenne, where she had been helping establish the territory's first public library, a project she had spearheaded. Life had been good. The ranch prospered. Their family grew. The ghosts of Boston had long since faded, replaced by the warm, solid reality of their life together. The iron-bound chest was still under their bed, but now it held Thomas's first pair of boots and their marriage certificate, not cash and a pistol. Lena saw them, and her face lit up. She ran into Heath's arms, and he held her tight, the familiar feel of her a comfort deep in his bones. He was no longer the lonely man who waited. He was a husband, a father, a man who had found his whole world right here, in the heart of Wyoming. The past was a part of their story, a chapter of darkness that made the light they lived in now seem all the brighter. They had faced down the monster and built a life on the ashes of their fear. It was a life of purpose, partnership, and a love that was as vast and enduring as the western sky. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected.